Hello, this is David. Welcome to a video review for Alan Malz, Financial Risk Management. And specifically, this is a continuation. This is the third section in the video series just for his chapter 12, which is called Liquidity and Leverage. So just to orient ourselves, just to make sure that you know where you are here. Chapter 12 is Liquidity and Leverage. It's a large chapter in Malz. And we have, consequently, a long list of learning objectives. And even, for example, in the previous video, the second section, we looked at just this one learning objective, which concerns the economic balance sheet and transactions. And you can see even it had sort of sub-ideas because it looked at different derivatives trades. So it's a dense chapter, and for that reason, we divided the videos into three parts. Part 1 concerned the first 4 learning objectives, and then, or I should say, I called it first section or section 1, and then we went to section 2, and which primarily concerned the economic as opposed to accounting balance sheet, and then transition into this video, which concerns the last 3 learning objectives here in chapter 12 for Malz. And for the first time here, what's most significant is that we have the introduction of a quantitative action verb, or calculate. And so I do want to highlight, from a practical exam standpoint, this is also the most important learning objective here in the third section, and specifically where it says calculate the liquidity adjustment to VAR for a position to be liquidated over a number of trading days. Okay, so there's a few different sub-ideas in the liquidity adjustment, but this is important because the FRM syllabus over at least a decade has a strong pattern on liquidity adjusted VAR. Liquidity adjusted VAR, and so I tend to call that LVAR. And so Malz is this, Alan Malz, the author of this chapter in this book, is relevant for that, and also relevant, you probably know, is Kevin Dowd, because he is also a long-time assignment for the liquidity adjusted VAR. So we're going to look at examples of that, but I highlight that because we have a strong pattern over the decade that this is a highly testable concept, and with some interesting sort of sub-ideas and different approaches. So we want to make sure to take a careful look at that. We start with the setup, explain methods to measure and manage funding liquidity risk and transactions liquidity risk. So just to remind where we started the chapter back in the first section where Malz introduces liquidity risk, you will recall that the first thing he did was divide liquidity risk up into 2 parts. Well, there was a systematic type of liquidity risk, but more importantly is the bifurcation of liquidity risk, which is classic and thematic in the FRM, into funding liquidity risk as opposed to transaction liquidity risk. And you may recall I sort of talked about this. So there's different ways to look at this, but I like to think about it in terms of, you know, a simplified balance sheet, and the funding liquidity risk is something we can think about as associated with the liability side, the sources of funds, funding liquid. If we think about a commercial bank where deposits are the source of funds, and the bank is conducting a maturity and liquidity transformation function by investing those funds in assets with longer durations and less maturity, hence the maturity and liquidity transformation function. But if we think about this funding liquidity risk is a specific type of risk that really reared its head in the global financial crisis. It's the risk that the sources of funds won't roll over or refinance or be there. There tend to be short-term liabilities on that balance sheet. So funding liquidity risk is the risk that we can't borrow or fund in order to make the investments or meet other obligations.